On Friday, January 30th, 1976, in Troyes, France, 7-year-old Philippe Bertrand left school, ecole pont-saint-marie, at midday. He walked a short distance with his friends before they parted ways. Every day, Philippe would walk with his younger brother, Christophe, from a nearby school just around the corner, and together they would wait at a florist just 50 meters away for their father, Gérald, to come and pick them up for lunch. But on this day, something was wrong. When Gérald arrived at the florist, expecting to see both his boys, they were nowhere to be found. The florist told him they had never arrived. Rushing back to the school, he found Christophe, but there was no signs of Philippe. Concern quickly turned to fear. Gérald took Christophe home, hoping for answers, but just minutes later, the phone rang. On the other end of the line was a man demanding a ransom of 1 million French francs, which was around $160,000. His chilling instructions on the phone was to not contact the police. In the span of just 20 minutes, Philippe Bertrand had vanished without a trace. The authorities acted immediately, knowing their priority was to find Philippe alive. Investigators retraced the short distance between Philippe's school and his brother's, going door to door, asking if anyone had seen the young boy or noticed him speaking to a stranger or getting into a car, but no one could confirm anything suspicious. Philippe had simply vanished. Meanwhile, police set up listening and recording devices inside the Bertrand family home, waiting for the kidnapper to call back, as he had promised. At 6:16 p.m, the phone rang again. This time, Philippe's father, Gérald, answered. The caller spoke politely, repeatedly assuring the father that Philippe was unharmed. The police had instructed Gérald to keep the call going as long as possible, giving them a chance to trace the location. He managed to keep the kidnapper on the line for 18 minutes, long enough for the police to pinpoint the source of the call. It was coming from a phone booth, not far away in a nearby neighborhood. Officers rushed to the scene, hoping to follow the suspect and be led to Philippe. When they arrived, the kidnapper was still inside the booth, talking on the phone. The police had strict orders not to intervene. They were to wait and follow him. But suddenly, a gendarmerie car approached, with its sirens blaring, alerting the suspect. Panicked, he fled, disappearing before officers could stop him. A critical mistake had been made. A miscommunication between police and the gendarmerie had led to conflicting orders. One group was to follow, the other to intercept, and in that confusion, their best chance of finding Philippe slipped through their fingers. For the next 10 days, there was only silence, and the fear that Philippe was in grave danger grew stronger. With few leads to pursue, the police turned to the press, making a desperate appeal to the public. Philippe's face was everywhere, on newspapers, television screens, and posters across France. Fear gripped the nation. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk to school alone, and kids were not allowed to play outside late. A town that once felt safe was now consumed by anxiety. The case had become national news, and all of France was waiting, watching, and hoping for a breakthrough. Following the second ransom call, investigators realized they were dealing with an amateur. No seasoned criminal would have stayed on the phone for 18 minutes. This led them to the conclusion that the kidnapper was likely someone who knew the family. They theorized that Philippe had been abducted in the short walk between his school and his brother's. If the perpetrator was someone familiar, Philippe wouldn't have questioned it. He would have gone with them willingly. The demand for 1 million francs also pointed to someone with personal knowledge of the family's financial situation. The Bertrands were not incredibly wealthy, but Gérald worked in an insurance office owned by his wife's father. They were well off, and the kidnapper must have believed they had the means to pay. Kidnappings in France were not uncommon at the time. Just a month earlier, in December 1975, the country had been shaken by the abduction of 9-year-old Christophe, the son of a wealthy pharmaceutical tycoon. He was released unharmed after his family paid a ransom of 20 million francs. Now Philippe's case was unfolding in the public eye, and the pressure was mounting. On the 6th of February, after days of silence from the kidnapper, police urged Philippe's parents to make a plea. His mother, Marie-Françoise, appeared before the cameras, her voice breaking as she begged for the safe return of her son.
Je suis la maman de Philippe. Je vous en supplie, rendez-le-moi. Ne nous laissez plus souffrir encore.
On the 10th of February, after days of agonizing silence, a breakthrough finally came in. A local priest received a letter from the kidnapper containing one of Philippe's gloves. The letter gave precise instructions for the family on where and when to deliver the ransom. So they quickly prepared the money, and Philippe's father, Gérard, set out to the designated location, followed discreetly by the police. When he arrived, instead of finding his son, he discovered another piece of Philippe's clothing, a shoe, and yet another letter with new instructions. This was only the beginning of what turned into a cruel and calculated scavenger hunt. At each location, more letters, more pieces of Philippe's clothing, and more directions awaited him. For 2 agonizing hours, Gérard followed the kidnapper's trail, clinging to the hope that it would lead him to his son. Finally, the last set of instructions directed him to a parking lot outside a restaurant 20 kilometers away. There he was told to drop the ransom in front of a hanging coat on a picket and leave. Police waited in hiding, their eyes locked on the money, but no one came. Desperate for answers, officers questioned the restaurant's owners, asking them if they had seen anyone or anything suspicious. They did report seeing a man lingering in the parking lot, pacing back and forth between a white car and the drop-off location, and at times he had been there without his car. They described him as a young man, around 25 years old, and wearing square glasses. Then, in a stroke of luck, the owner pointed out the suspicious vehicle outside the restaurant parking lot, getting ready to drive off. The police immediately followed it and traced the registration back to a name that would soon become infamous in France, Patrick Henry. At 6 a.m. on the 11th of February, the following morning, police brought Patrick Henry in for questioning. He offered no resistance, maintaining his innocence from the start. Calm and composed, he insisted he was merely a friend of the Bertrand family and that it was pure coincidence witnesses had seen him near the ransom drop. He denied any involvement, showing no signs of fear or guilt. As investigators dug deeper into his background, they discovered that Patrick did in fact know the Bertrands. Born on the 31st of March, 1953, in Troyes, he was the youngest of 5 children. He had a reputation for disregarding rules from a young age, frequently stealing from colleagues, and even once taking a car. While he had a minor criminal record, he had always managed to avoid prison. One detail stood out: he was in serious financial trouble. Patrick had accumulated significant debt, and rather than working to pay it off, he often schemed ways to make quick money. Could he have gone so far as to kidnap a child for ransom? Investigators were convinced they had their man, but their priority was finding little Philippe, hoping he was still alive. Officer Pellegrini was the head of the OCRB, and he took a personal interest in the case. As a father himself to an 8-year-old boy, he was growing increasingly impatient. Certain that Patrick was the kidnapper, Officer Pellegrini decided to take a drastic approach. He drove Patrick out into the wilderness, pulled out his gun, and demanded to know where Philippe was. Patrick remained eerily calm, and he looked up at the officer in the eye and said, "Kill me if you want, but you would be killing an innocent man." Frustrated, Officer Pellegrini fired a few rounds into the air, but Patrick didn't flinch, he simply smiled. Patrick knew that the officer would never have shot him and was simply trying to scare him. With no evidence to hold him, police had no choice but to release him, but they weren't about to let him go far. From that moment on, they kept a very close eye on him. By the 13th of February, Patrick Henry was reveling in the media attention. He eagerly stopped for interviews, answering questions from reporters with an air of confidence and even outrage. He openly condemned the way he had been treated, insisting it was absurd to suspect him. After all, he was a friend of the Bertrand family. Far from shying away from the spotlight, Patrick leaned into it. One of the most infamous moments came during an interview inside a shop he co-owned with his brother in the center of the town. He spoke freely about the case, portraying himself as a victim of injustice. His composure, charm, and self-assuredness convinced many that he couldn't possibly be involved. How could someone so relaxed, so vocal, and so close to the family be responsible?
Il faut dire qu'il y avait quand même beaucoup de coïncidences, reconnaissez-le vous-même, qui faisaient quand même que vous auriez pu, enfin vous correspondez exactement.
Oui, bien sûr. Bien sûr, il y a eu des coïncidences qui ont fait que, d'ailleurs, c'est pourquoi la police s'est adressée à moi. C'est les coïncidences.
Et quel était votre sentiment quand vous entendez cet appel?
Mais écoutez, ça fait mal au cœur pour les parents et puis surtout pour le petit garçon.
The public was divided. Many believed Patrick was innocent, while others remained skeptical. But what truly shocked everyone was a phone interview he gave, where he made a chilling statement. People who kidnap children deserve the death penalty.
Monsieur le Cagnier disait il y a quelques jours qu'il était pour la peine de mort pour les rapts d'enfants. Est-ce que c'est aussi votre avis?
Moi, je pense que c'est oui. C'est mon avis.
Vous pensez qu'il est mort ou vivant?
Je m'efforce de penser qu'il soit vivant. De tout mon cœur, le plus possible.
On the 17th of February 1976, after Patrick's numerous media appearances, the investigation took a critical turn. An anonymous tip came in, claiming they had seen Patrick de-icing his car near a restaurant in a town just outside of Troyes. The fact that he was clearing frost from his windshield suggested that the car had been parked there overnight. A strange detail, considering Patrick lived in the centre of Troyes. Why would he leave his car there? Investigators followed up on the lead, going door to door in the area with Patrick's photograph, asking if anyone had seen him. Most people said no, except for the owner of the restaurant. He recognized the man in the picture, but not as Patrick Henry. He had been renting a room upstairs since the 23rd of January under a different name. Suspicious, the police asked to speak with him. The restaurant owner said they could go up, as Patrick was there. He could hear his footsteps coming from the room upstairs. When they reached the door, they forced entry, but before they could stop him, Patrick tried to flee through the window and onto the roof. Officers were quick, however, and they managed to grab him before he could escape. They pulled him back inside, where without hesitation, Patrick made a chilling admission, saying that the child was dead and was wrapped in a sleeping bag under the bed. On the 20th of February 1976, 3 days after Philippe Bertrand was found, he was laid to rest. The entire community mourned. Shops in the area closed for the day as a mark of respect, and people gathered in silence, grieving the innocent life that had been taken. That same day, Patrick Henry decided to give a statement. In it, he claimed that killing Philippe had never been his intention. His plan, he said, was to keep the boy until the ransom was paid and then let him go. He described how in the beginning he had treated Philippe well. They played cards together and he tried to keep the child calm. But everything changed after the failed ransom call at the phone booth. That night, Patrick returned to his rented room and Philippe began asking him questions. The next day, Patrick went for a walk and noticed an increased police presence in the area. When he returned, Philippe was watching television. Suddenly, his own face appeared on the screen in a news report. Realizing that he was the missing boy everyone was searching for, Philippe began to cry, saying he wanted to go home to his parents. Patrick panicked. He grabbed a piece of cloth, wrapped it around the child's neck, and strangled him. Afterwards, Patrick packed his bags and went on a skiing holiday in Switzerland with his friends. But investigators weren't convinced by his version of events. The autopsy revealed that Philippe had been dead for at least 15 days, aligning with the day of the failed ransom call. Thankfully, the medical examination confirmed that the child had not been sexually assaulted. However, toxicology reports found traces of drugs in his system. This led investigators to a conclusion. Patrick had never planned to release Philippe. From the moment he took him, the boy was as good as dead. If Patrick let him go, Philippe could identify him. The kidnapping had been meticulously planned. He had rented the room, and he had even changed the lock on his door to ensure no one could enter. Patrick Henry was immediately arrested and charged with murder. The case deeply shook France. The public demanded the harshest possible punishment, the death penalty by guillotine, which was still legal at the time. Even Patrick's own father publicly declared that his son deserved to die for what he had done.
Dites tout à l'heure que même s'il était condamné à mort, vous le comprendriez.
C'est normal. Moi, j'estime que la condamnation à mort est la juste punition de ce qu'il a fait.
At the time of Philippe's tragic death, the guillotine was still the legal method of execution in France, and many people were certain that Patrick Henry deserved to face it. Public outcry was immense, with some calling for him to be tortured before his death, others even suggesting he should be strangled with the same cord he used to kill Philippe. The public saw him as the monster, indefensible and beyond redemption. Despite the overwhelming public sentiment, Philippe's parents, Gérard and Marie-Françoise, made it clear they did not want Patrick to die. They simply wanted justice for their son, but they also did not want him freed. In the face of such intense anger, no lawyer in Troyes was willing to defend him. One by one, legal professionals refused, leaving him without representation. That is, until Robert Boquillon, head of the Bar of Troyes, contacted Robert Badinter, a passionate opponent of capital punishment. Robert Badinter, despite knowing the firestorm he would face, agreed to take the case on. Robert's decision was controversial, to say the least. As a result, he received hate mail that was so overwhelming it filled a garbage bag. Things escalated further when a homemade bomb was placed at his door, though no one was hurt. Yet, Robert pressed on, determined to challenge the morality of the death penalty itself. Robert argued that capital punishment was a flawed system. He emphasized that the state should not have the power to take a life, even in the most extreme circumstances. His defense was not about excusing Patrick's crime, but about questioning whether the state had the right to kill, no matter the crime. The emotionally charged trial began on the 17th of January 1977 with Robert Badinter defending Patrick Henry. But rather than focusing solely on his client's humanity, Robert turned the trial into a moral debate about the death penalty itself. He spoke of the process as a dehumanizing act. Patrick would be strapped to a board, pushed onto the guillotine's platform, and then, as Robert put it, cut in two. Robert then turned to the jury with a profound question. Are you willing to tell your children that you sent a man to his death? He challenged them to consider their legacy in the years to come, saying, in 10-20 years, the death sentence will be abolished. You'll then tell your children that you were responsible for sending one of the last people to their deaths, and you'll see the way they look at you. To support his argument, Robert called witnesses to testify about the horrors of the death penalty. First, a prison officer explained what life was like for those on death row, detailing the psychological toll it took on inmates who knew they were facing the guillotine. Then Patrick's mother and sister took the stand, offering a glimpse of the man behind the crime, humanizing him in the eyes of the jury. Robert, however, didn't shy away from acknowledging the gravity of Patrick's crime. He told the jury that if they truly believed in the death penalty, then they should send Patrick to his death. But if they didn't, if they believed in a more humane justice system, now was the time to stand against capital punishment. He delivered a powerful closing statement, saying, "If you decide to kill Patrick Henry, it is each of you that I will see in the early morning at dawn, and I would say to myself that it was you and you alone who decided."
Vous avez seul le droit de virer fort sur quelqu'un. À cet égard, dites-vous bien, si vous le coupez en deux, eh bien ça ne dissuadera rien ni personne.
On the 18th of January 1977, after a tense deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. In France, capital punishment required at least 8 out of 12 jurors to vote in favour of the death sentence. But in the end, Patrick Henry was spared by a single vote, and he was given a life sentence. At least 3 jurors later revealed that they voted against the death penalty because of their Catholic beliefs. Despite the Bertrand family's repeated statements that they did not want Patrick Henry to be executed, the public was still divided. Many were outraged, believing the crime warranted a death sentence, while others saw the decision as a step forward in the evolution of justice. When Patrick surprisingly learned he would not face the guillotine, he quietly thanked the jurors, saying, "You will not regret your decision." Even the judge was taken aback by the verdict, as it had been so contentious and divisive. Outside the courtroom, the streets were filled with anger. A mob pressed against the police barriers, screaming for Patrick's execution. Patrick Henry would spend decades behind bars. Over time, however, things began to shift. Robert Badinter, the same man who had defended Patrick at trial, was appointed Minister of Justice in 1981, making abolishing the death penalty his first major act in office, marking a monumental shift in France's judicial system. Meanwhile, Patrick Henry began to change during his time in prison. He turned to education, earning his baccalaureate, a degree in mathematics, and an advanced qualification in computer programming. He also founded a small company in prison, employing fellow inmates to develop software for schools. By the time he was serving his sentence, he had proven himself a skilled worker. After serving over 2 decades behind bars, his case returned to the public eye. The question of whether he should be granted parole sparked renewed debate. Patrick had made several requests for parole during his incarceration, and they were rejected each time. Yet, it wasn't until a change in the law that allowed parole decisions to be handled by a specialized independent tribunal that he was given a second chance. At 46 years old, Patrick Henry claimed to have changed. His request for release was met with a range of reactions. Psychiatric experts, prison directors, and judges all voiced support for his parole, stating that he had shown genuine remorse and rehabilitation. However, the decision wasn't without its challenges. The Minister of Justice at the time publicly acknowledged the difficulty of her decision. While she noted that all expert opinions were positive, she also reminded the public that Patrick had committed an unforgivable crime. As the debate over his release intensified, Robert once again spoke in Patrick's defense. He said, "Patrick Henry committed an atrocious crime, but he was 22 years old. He'll have spent 1/3 of his life in prison. If that's not punishment, what is?" He argued that Patrick's reformation should be taken into account and that continuing to imprison him would serve no further purpose. So finally, on the 15th of May 2001, after 24 years in prison, Patrick Henry was granted parole. After his release, Patrick found work at a printing company in Normandy, hopefully beginning a promising new chapter in his life. During his time in prison, he had started writing a memoir, and upon his release, he eagerly reached out to publishers, hoping to share his story. Many assumed he would try to live quietly, distancing himself from his past, but instead, he sought to profit from it. He contacted several publishers, offering his memoirs. One publisher rejected his offer, accusing him of being motivated by money rather than redemption. However, in April 2002, Patrick granted an interview to Paris Match, where he appeared with his face uncovered, revealing his changed appearance since his trial. Despite the backlash, his memoir was eventually accepted by Calman Levy, with the working title, "You Won't Regret It," a reference to his words upon learning he had avoided the death penalty. However, the book's publication was suspended in the fall of 2002 after a series of events that further tarnished his image. On the 26th of June 2002, Patrick was arrested for shoplifting at a large DIY store in Mondeville. He had stolen tools worth €76 and was fined €2,000. His employer at the printing company fired him, and the thought of his parole being revoked loomed. Months later, he was then convicted of drug trafficking after he was caught in Spain coming from Morocco with a car full of cannabis. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, fined €20,000, and had his parole revoked. The commission that had once approved his release now refused to consider his parole request, and Patrick Henry was sent back to prison. Eventually, his book was published under a new title, So Do You Regret It? The release of this sensationalized memoir ignited a national debate over whether convicts should be allowed to profit from their crimes. The French Justice Minister, Dominique Perben, expressed his deep shock at the publication, while victims' associations strongly opposed it. Philippe's father, who had vowed to kill Patrick if he was ever released, felt vindicated. He said, "Men like him never change. On the surface, maybe, but whatever drives someone to commit such atrocities will always be inside them. He should not have been freed." Justice Minister Dominique Perben stated that his arrest was a personal failure for Patrick, but not a failure for France's parole system, pointing to statistics showing that prisoners released on parole were less likely to reoffend than those released at the end of their sentences. Back in prison, Patrick appealed his conviction, but his appeal was rejected. On the 14th of November 2011, he went on a hunger strike, protesting his circumstances. Those who knew him and visited him in prison said he clearly looked demoralized and had clearly given up. After years of legal battle, on the 15th of September 2017, at the age of 64, Patrick Henry was released from prison once again due to terminal lung cancer. The prosecutor's office confirmed that his sentence was suspended on medical grounds. Patrick Henry passed away on the 3rd of December 2017, less than 3 months after his release. The case of Patrick Henry remains one of France's most haunting crimes, not just for the life he took, but for the second chance he was given and ultimately destroyed. Philippe Bertrand never got a second chance. At just 7 years old, his future was stolen from him in the most cruel and senseless way. His parents were left with an unimaginable loss, a pain that time could never erase. And yet, the man who took their son was spared the fate so many demanded for him. Patrick Henry was granted mercy, an opportunity to rebuild his life, something Philippe would never have. For a time, it seemed he had changed. He educated himself, built a career, and convinced the justice system he was reformed. But in the end, he proved his worst critics right. The man who had been spared by the guillotine threw away his second chance, returning to crime and betraying the trust that had once saved him. He died a free man, but his life was nothing more than a series of wasted opportunities. France moved forward, capital punishment was abolished, laws changed, and society evolved. But for Philippe's family, time stood still on that winter night in 1976. As always, my heart goes out to them and to everyone impacted by this horrible crime. And finally, rest in peace, Philippe Bertrand.